There's an article by Stephen Allen dated June 23, 2018. Political leaders and journalists are deeply concerned about Russian meddling in U.S. elections. It took them long enough. The Russians have been meddling in U.S. elections for at least 70 years. In 1948, the Progressive Party, there's some I know are thinking the Democratic Party should change their name to Progressive Party, and there are those advocating such thing. They like to informally call themselves the Progressives. But in 1948, the Progressive Party was a front for the Soviet-controlled Communist Party. They ran former Vice President Henry Wallace as its presidential candidate. Wallace arguably threw the election to President Truman by attacking him, undercutting Republicans' claims that Truman was soft on the Russians. President Eisenhower, and this is a quote from October 21, 1956, President Eisenhower today accused Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin of meddling in the American election campaign, the United Press reported. Again, that was October 21st, 1956. The Bulganin had suggested that Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson was more likely to get an agreement halting H-bomb tests. That, Eisenhower said, constituted interference by a foreign nation in our internal affairs in the midst of a national election campaign. Historian Bruce Dearstein reported that the Russian ambassador in 1960 invited Stevenson, that's Adlai Stevenson, to the embassy, plied him with drinks, caviar, and fruit, and offered to back him if he would run for president again. Stevenson rejected the offer. That was the Russian ambassador in 1960, clearly attempting to interfere. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier in 1960, bragged in his memoirs that, quote, by waiting to release the U-2 pilot Gary Powers until after the American election, we kept Nixon from being able to claim that he could deal with the Russians. Our ploy made a difference of at least 500,000 votes, which gave Kennedy the edge he needed. So you got Nikita Khrushchev bragging that he got John F. Kennedy elected. I'm not saying that. I'm just reading what's historically available. In 1968, under orders from Moscow, the Soviet U.S. ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin offered to secretly fund Hubert Humphrey's presidential campaign. The offer was made during a breakfast at Humphrey's home. Dobrynin wrote in his memoirs that Humphrey declined the offer, saying, quote, it was more than enough for him to have Moscow's good wishes, which he highly appreciated, unquote. That was the 60s Democratic Party hero Hubert Humphrey. In 1976, Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, a strong anti-communist, ran for president. The Russians sent forged FBI letters to journalists claiming that Jackson was a closeted homosexual. Of course, today that'd probably get him elected, but in 1976, not so helpful. Also in 1976, the Russians had a spy among top Democratic Party activists who participated in a 3-hour strategy session with Governor Jerry Brown of California, presidential candidate Jimmy Carter. In 1984, the Heritage Foundation issued a report, quote, how Moscow meddles in the West's elections, unquote. 1984. Quote, last year, the Soviets tried to influence elections in West Germany and Britain, unquote, Heritage reported. Quote, and this year, it is America's turn. For months, Moscow's statements and actions have been aimed at defeating Ronald Reagan, unquote. Methods included manipulation of the peace movement, threatening statements, and direct appeals to voters, including mass demonstrations. Russian meddling was also frequent that the West German chancellor commented, quote, "One was used to this sort of thing," unquote. As far as I can tell, the report exposing Russian meddling received no news coverage. Political scientists Lawrence Caldwell and Robert Levgold pointed out that the Russians had begun to focus on such tactics as looking for, quote, exploitable differences in the opposing camp, unquote, and appealing to the people, quote, over the heads of their government. U.S. media during this time gave lots of exposure to Americans who bypassed the government to communicate directly with the Russians. For example, a 10-year-old girl from Maine who wrote a pro-peace letter to Russian leader Yuri Andropov was given her own Disney Channel program about politics, quote, "Samantha Smith goes to Washington," unquote. Among those seeking to work with the Russians was U.S. Senator Edward Kennedy, Democrat from Massachusetts, brother of martyred President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. According to a KGB memo, of course this has been news years ago, but Kennedy passed along a plan for countering President Reagan by creating a pro-Russia news coverage and bringing Soviet officials to the United States to, quote, appeal directly to the American people, unquote. KGB chief Viktor Chebrikov wrote, quote, "The senator underlined the importance that this initiative should be seen as coming from the American side," unquote. In a 2015 article, PolitiFact, which I can't give a lot of credence to, but they quoted Ken Edelman, Reagan's deputy UN ambassador, explaining that the Reagan administration ignored the Kennedy overture because we knew senators were doing this sort of thing all the time. Russian meddling declined after the Cold War and then resumed. Occupy Wall Street protests, and this is important news. Occupy Wall Street protests beginning in 2011 were heavily supported by the Russians, as noted in a report by U.S. intelligence agencies. Quote, RT's, Russia Today, editor-in-chief, characterized RT's coverage of the Occupy Wall Street movement as, quote, information warfare, unquote, that is aimed at promoting popular dissatisfaction with the U.S. government. RT created a Facebook app to connect Occupy Wall Street protesters via social media, and RT featured its own host in Occupy rallies. Obviously, in 2011 and 2012, this isn't in the article, but obviously the Russians were playing heavily in that election, and we had a president named Obama that could have done something to stop the Russians from trying to throw the election to the Obama campaign by harming the Republicans and helping Occupy Wall Street movement. But the Obama administration did nothing of the sort. Back to the article, it says at least since 2011, the Russians have funneled money to groups in the United States and Europe opposed to fracking, which threatens Russia's dominance in oil and gas. And in fairness, with regard to the Russian funding efforts to stop the fracking that's made the United States the biggest oil producer, those efforts weren't entirely Russia. Yes, our ability to produce more oil has directly harmed Russia, but it's also hurt the Middle East. And you can find that there were programs and videos funded by people in the Middle East to scare Americans, to put them against fracking so that Russia, and the Middle East could go back to being where most of the oil was coming from. Anyway, this article says to do this, talking about opposing fracking, The Russians used a network of front organizations to include corporations, law firms, nonprofit groups, with some of the money getting into the United States through Bermuda. Facing criticism from Republicans over his soft on Putin policies, President Obama sought during his 2012 re-election campaign to avoid confrontation with the Russians. Of course, inserting parenthetically here, when he knew the Russians were helping his campaign and hurting Mitt Romney's campaign, then of course that played into his decision not to try to stop the Russians meddling in the U.S. election. The Russians cooperated. March 2012, Obama was heard on an open microphone telling Putin's sidekick Dmitry Medvedev that he would have, quote, more flexibility, unquote, after the election, but, quote, it's important for him to give me space, unquote. Medvedev replied, quote, I will transmit this information to Vladimir, and I stand with you. So maybe that had something to do with the Obama administration not wanting to confront Russia about their meddling, because they were meddling on behalf of Obama. In any event, the article says time and time again Russia meddled. It was, quote, the experts, unquote, said. Something we were used to, something that happened all the time, no big deal. Then one day, Democrats needed an excuse for losing an election, and everything changed. So an interesting article there by Stephen J. Allen, June 23rd.